The Seth Leibsohn Show, where it's principles, not politics. Now, guest hosting for Seth, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Yes, you heard that right. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for my good friend Seth Leibsohn, as he is getting some well-deserved time off this week. And, the doctor is in the house, and hopefully I can fill the big shoes, the smart, intellectual leadership that Seth has shown here, and it's just an honor to sit in his chair this week. So welcome, and thank you for welcoming me to your listening audience, and I look forward to spending this time together. You know, as Seth mentioned on Thursday, I just returned from CPAC, so we have a lot to talk about what the conservative community in America has been discussing, and also to let you in a little bit about what I do and who I am, and get to know one another. As was introduced, my name is Zuhdi Jasser. I'm a physician in town here, served in the Navy 11 years, and after 9/11, I was called to a different service, which was to try to move to protect America in a way that countered the ideologies that threatened us. Many of us Muslims, locally and nationally, have felt that it wasn't just an ideology that we were fighting, and it wasn't just a tactic, but rather a larger ideology, and that ideology being a political Islam. So we formed, one of the things that I do is the American Islamic Forum for Democracy as a think tank to counter the ideas that fuel radical Islam. And now, as many of you see in the headlines and elsewhere, that ultimately ISIS has sadly and horrifically validated our mission statement, which was to separate mosque and state, and that ultimately we're not fighting a tactic. It'd be like in World War II if we said that we were fighting blitzkrieg and we were fighting Nazism. And the president said it to the UN a few weeks ago, and he said it actually in the White House in his conference, misnamed or confusingly named as the Conference on Countering Violent Extremism, and yet our country seems to be led in the wrong direction to countering tactics. It was interesting that he mentioned countering Nazism and countering communism in the 20th century, but then when it came to the 21st century, he said we were going to defeat violent extremism. And unfortunately, as many of you may know, the reformist Muslims who would be the ones to really help lead this weren't even invited to the White House conference. And he continues to harbor under the assumption that we're fighting a tactic. And this is why we have no strategy. And I think the U.S. News hit it right yesterday in its blog in talking about CPAC, in saying that CPAC had foreign policy front and center. And it talked about some of the panels that I participated in. And we'll get to that in a minute. But my friendship with Seth goes way back. I have, after 9/11, gotten to know many of his friends, including Bill Bennett, Jim Woolsey, and others who have been America's heroes and leaders in protecting us against the ideology that threatens this country, not only domestically but abroad. And I've learned so much from the people that he considers friends, and we have gotten to be good friends. So today I hope to let you in a little bit about the way we think. And I scared Seth a little bit and told him, what do you think about the intro of the jihad is in the house? No, I said that wouldn't work, no. And Bill almost had a heart attack just now. But basically our goal is a jihad against jihad. And this is so important. We call it like we see it. I'm a Muslim who loves my faith, loves America, and feels that we have to defeat jihadism. That is the threat. Now, what Seth appropriately told me was it's ijtihad, not jihad. And ijtihad is really the Muslim concept of modern reform, of the interpretation of Scripture in light of modern day in a modern concept. And that's really what we're trying to do, and unfortunately what the president has not been allowing us the space to do. And as I said at CPAC, who would have thought a small small-town Neenah, Wisconsin boy who started writing a high school column in my paper in the early 80s about conservatism called On the Right Track, ultimately then 30 years later would be speaking to CPAC. It was a humbling experience to speak from the main stage, and right after Mark Levin spoke, and to talk about where our country should be headed, and where our leadership should be leading us. It's interesting. One of the quotes of one of my mentors and people that I've read and learned quite a bit was from Bassam Tibi. He said he's a German Muslim scholar from Syria. Also, my family hailed from Syria and escaped persecution in Syria. And I know Seth last week was talking about how important the story is, and an individual's narrative is. And in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, I talk about my own story. And Bassam Tibi said, the secularization of Christianity did not bring about its demise. He said he would argue that it brought about its liberation to the personal domain. This culture is still very Christian, but it just doesn't have to coerce it in law to be so, because the character of the people is Christian and Jewish and many faiths. That is the culture, the character we see. Religion must simply be protected from state exploitation. That's a Muslim who grew up in Germany, and he said when he retired that he was going to retire in America. He didn't retire in Germany after teaching for 30, 40 years there. He retired in America, and he said the reason is he didn't feel German despite living there for 35, 40 years. And it's because Europe has a bigger problem than we do, because they still are struggling with what is the ideology that makes them unite against threats like political Islam or Islamism. America, because of our roots against theocracy, and as I spoke at CPAC, is, I think, uniquely positioned to begin to battle against radical Islam and the pool in which radical Islamists swim. So together, let's navigate some of these details and concepts and understand what the narrative is. I think the narrative and the story of my family coming from Syria, escaping oppression under the fascist Arabists of the Baathists, which were the socialists, the Nazis of Syria in the 60s, who ultimately took power. And then Hafez Assad took over in 1970, and now his son is continuing to savage the population of Syria. And we'll get into ISIS and the current threat globally soon. And I have to tell you, there's a quote that I can't remember if it was Seth or one of our friends gave me from Teddy Roosevelt. And the phrase, daring greatly, is from Theodore Roosevelt's speech, Citizenship in a Republic. The speech, sometimes referred to as the Man in the Arena, was delivered at the Sorbonne in Paris, France, on April 23rd, 1910. So this was right before the World War I. And ultimately, he said this famous passage, which has guided my life and why I do what I do. It says, it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again. Because there is no effort without error or shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause? Who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement? And who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly? So, I'm in the arena. I've been in the arena. Seth was in the arena long before I was, nationally, and making change happen, or at least trying to do so through efforts and all of our own shortcomings that we have. And I think this is why I'm here and why I take the time to do what I do. So, it's amazing. The reason I became a conservative, and I thought about this as I prepared my remarks for CPAC, and conservatism is about small government. It's about less taxation. It's about freedom from coercion of government. It's about principles of individualism and free markets and anti-theocracy and being able to be who you want to be. But I think ultimately my parents understood this country to be at its core about religious freedom. That is the message, the narrative of America that ISIS, Saudi Arabia, the Islamists of the world do not want us to know and do not want us to spread. Prime Minister Netanyahu today gave comments about the need to spread liberalism. in his speech to AIPAC, and tomorrow his long-awaited speech to Congress will be given. And it's amazing, yet we see the criticisms and the politics going back and forth, and yet it is amazing that Iran, who is the primary enemy, no one seems to talk about. Later, we're going to be joined by Adam Credo of the Free Beacon, who's going to prep us in understanding what we will learn tomorrow, not only from Prime Minister Netanyahu, but of the entire dynamic. I want to talk to you later about a Saudi columnist who wrote a column congratulating Prime Minister Netanyahu about his boldness in making the speech to Congress tomorrow, and the impertinence and blindness of the left in America and of other anti-Semitic and Islamist causes that are avoiding the real threat of Iran. And I want to talk to you also and spend a few minutes talking about the death of Leonard Nimoy, one of the characters that I grew up with in Star Trek. And, you can't help but remember the Gene Roddenberry not only introduction music, but the fact that science fiction was actually deeply political. And the Washington Post had an editorial about how political Star Trek was and what we learned from it. And when we come back from the break, I want to talk to you a little bit about that and how it fits into what we can be doing in our vision today that we've been missing.
The final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission: to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
So, Leonard Nimoy, an icon of Star Trek and of all science fiction, God rest his soul, he passed away this weekend. And I couldn't help but spend some time not only talking about Star Trek, but reflecting on what that meant to America. As you could listen to their opening, there was an element there in the opening of Star Trek that Americans pulled into, and it was almost canceled initially, and then there was a petition that allowed it to continue. It was formed initially in 1966, and ultimately there's an element in that opening to boldly go where no man, and then they said no one has ever gone. It's about, I saw it about American exceptionalism, about the ability of our society to protect the world, to protect mankind from all evil. And what was, I think, what allowed Spock or Leonard Nimoy to bring that together was he was the character that was supposedly not emotional, that did not have that sense of making decisions in error because of emotion. And yet, ultimately, his demise, at the time of his death in one of the movies, it was basically his statement that the good of the many outweighs the good of the few was why he ended up sacrificing himself. So to see that conflict between an emotional, reasonable, ethical, moral man who was somewhat inhuman and yet portrayed as much as influenced by the exceptionalism of the Starship Enterprise and the crew that Captain Kirk and others had. So, I think as an American, there is nothing that epitomizes what our ideals were in our country more than Star Trek and Leonard Nimoy. I was taken by an editorial in the Washington Post by Stephen Dyson, who talked about the politics of Star Trek, and he had comments in here that compared. He said The Undiscovered Country, which was one of the episodes, was a story about the end of Cold War in space, and that there was a massive explosion on the Klingon planet, which he read as Soviet Union, the moon of the Praxis, read as Chernobyl, or prompting of a reforming chancellor, or Gorkon, which he read then as President Mikhail Gorbachev, to sue for peace. Nimoy's question, "Who am I if I have no enemy to define me?" anticipated the post-Cold War preoccupation of international relations scholars with the issue of identity rather than older questions of material power. So ultimately, you see, that as this program unfolded, it was about the conflict of good America against the evil empire, which is what Ronald Reagan defined them as. And as this conservative, I was growing up in a small town in Wisconsin. I saw that in Star Trek, and when I read this, I couldn't help but reflecting on how much I could relate to Dyson's comments in the Washington Post. So, Leonard Nimoy, rest in peace. We'll miss you. Let's talk a little bit about CPAC. It's interesting if you look at the New York Times, the newspaper of record of the White House. It had an editorial today, said the CPAC, Hackneyed and Hollow, by Charles Blow. Certainly his column, he started off saying that he expected to see, he always goes with an open mind and watched it online, and yet he persisted and then said how disappointed he was in CPAC and focused simply on what the candidates had to say. And yes, all of us conservatives are waiting anxiously to listen to the candidates and what each of them has to say, but it's pretty early for that, and yet that's all they focused on. What I learned, and this was my second CPAC, I presented last year also, but it's just fascinating to me how they ignore the fact that there's a reason the American Conservative Union and then the Conference on Political Action Conference that we have, or CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, exists, which is to bring together people that believe in a common idea, which is conservatism. So ultimately, this idea, yes, as Seth was talking about last week, there has been a significant group within of libertarians and others, but there's so much we share in common as a conservative movement, and I, as Seth, have a number of libertarian leanings within me. But I do think the conversation on foreign policy especially, that we had a panel on can Islam and democracy coexist, and then in my main stage discussion along with leaders such as Colonel Pete Hegseth and others on the panel with me, we talked about, what is America's national security in the age of jihad? Not in the age of violent extremism, but in the age of jihad. So what is our foreign policy? What should be our strategy? And that's what we talked about. And ultimately, that foreign policy is, I think, best discussed at a conference of conservatives. And yet this New York Times editorial didn't even touch on it. The apologetics for the administration's cowardice or inability to address the problem. You can call it, as I mentioned from the podium, that this was our president has become an excommunicator-in-chief because he refuses to engage reformist Muslims, those of us who actually identify Islamism or political Islam as the problem, and spiritual Islam, an Islam that's anti-theocracy as the solution. And there is no more American solution than an anti-theocratic Islam that identifies the organization of the Islamic cooperation. Every one of you should know what that is, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It's a mafia of 56 countries that are a subset of a voting bloc of the UN that includes all the Muslim majority countries, is based out of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and that OIC is today's evil empire. And I think if Reagan was alive, and if you read Natan Sharansky's op-ed from the Washington Post a month ago, in which he said, where is the president that would identify prisoners of conscience as he was in the Soviet Union 30 years ago? Where is a president that would identify prisoners of conscience as our allies and these thugocracies and theocracies as our enemies? And yet we went and eulogized the king of Saudi Arabia as some kind of hero when in fact he was an evil tyrant who jailed Muslims like myself. And I'd ask you to look at what happened to Raif Badawi, a prisoner now who is struggling for his life as he gets whipped and flogged every week in front of a mosque in Jeddah. And actually they didn't flog him the last 2 Fridays because he would die, and they want to have him suffer longer and longer. And for every one Raif Badawi, there's thousands in jails in Saudi Arabia and Iran and Egypt and Pakistan and many of these countries that we consider our allies against Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Our factories, they're little boot camps for producing these radicals, and yet we consider them our allies. So that paradigm needs to change. And ultimately, the only way to change it is to empower reformist Muslims, not have conferences against violent extremism, but conferences against Islamism, and have conferences like we did at CPAC where Muslims stood up and non-Muslims and said, we are not here to have a war against Islam, but one against the ideology that fuels radical Islam, which is Islamism, and separate mosque and state in a very American battle. So when we come back, let's talk about some of those reformists. And this is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth Leibsohn, who's taking a well-deserved week off, and it's a privilege to be in his chair on the Seth Leibsohn Show. I wear a hat as the chairman and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and have been doing work locally, nationally, and globally on fighting the ideologies that threaten us, not only from ISIS, but all of the radical groups and the countries that fuel those ideologies. And also, I'm a local physician in practice and have been very active in countering Obamacare and working with organized medicine and private practice and trying to preserve any semblance that remains of the private practice of medicine. But let's get back to soon we're going to be joined by Adam Credo from the Free Beacon, and I wanted to set the stage for that discussion by talking about, it's interesting that the dichotomy that has arisen in the political hand-wringing about whether Congress should have invited Prime Minister Netanyahu and whether they violated diplomatic protocol, to me all seems like nonsense. I mean, the bottom line is presidents and prime ministers speak to parliaments around the world all the time in order to educate and explain to them directly what their message is. It doesn't violate foreign policy. It doesn't take away control of foreign policy from the president, but simply allows them to speak directly to the American people and our representatives in Congress. So I just don't get that. But the more amazing thing to me is how the narrative, and again, as Seth said last week, it's about narratives. The narrative against Iran, we're feeding into the Islamist mantra that somehow it's about non-Muslims against Muslims or Israel against the Islamic governments, when in fact, if you look, who should be the greatest proponents about a strong and hawkish position against Iran as the son of Syrian immigrants who's seeing my family dodge barrel bombs in Syria that have been funded and fueled by the Iranian regime now for over 3 years in their revolution, and who has heard of thousands of Republican Guard military from Iran, taking over the Syrian state, which has basically become a proxy state of Iran. And as Prime Minister Netanyahu said today, Iran is gobbling up countries like there's no tomorrow, from Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, and yet nobody seems to be making that narrative. And I'm wondering, where are the Syrian Muslim voices, Christian voices, and others of American citizenry, of European citizenry, speaking out and saying, Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments are our comments. We believe that the strength, the position of protecting Israel against Iran serves the benefit of mankind, not only politics, but mankind, because the threat of Iran is existential. They have fueled suicide bombers like Hezbollah, bombers who would believe that a suicidal operation will bring them closer to heaven. So why wouldn't a government armed with nuclear weapons believe the same thing, where the former president, Ahmadinejad, believed he would open his UN speeches by saying that he wanted to usher in the 12th Imam. So this is a country that we want to take a chance with by giving them nuclear weapons? So I believe this narrative, and obviously the talks are important, and nobody's saying there isn't a realpolitik element to the diplomacy between President Obama and Iran, or Secretary Kerry in Iran. But, if we look, there's a column today in the Saudi press that talked about, that said, by title, Netanyahu is right to insist on addressing Congress about the Iran deal. And Ahmed al-Faraj spoke and wrote about this, and basically he said, in a move unprecedented in the U.S. political history, Prime Minister Netanyahu received an invitation from the Speaker of the House, Republican John Boehner, to address both the houses of Congress. And he then goes on to talk about how important this message is and how off President Obama is. And he said he'll conclude by saying the following: since Obama is the godfather of the prefabricated revolutions in the Arab world, and since he is the ally of political Islam. And then he goes on. So this is what's happening to our image around the world. You have columnists writing that we are not on the right side of history against political Islam. Now, I'm not a fan of the monarchy of Saudi Arabia, as I made clear before. So ultimately, this columnist, I think we need to separate between the oligarchical Islamists, which are the monarchies that are now all of a sudden conveniently speaking against the Islamist grassroots movements like the Brotherhood or even the militants of Al-Qaeda, and they call them their threat, but yet they're fueling these ideas because they won't abandon the Islamic State. So, it's interesting that ultimately both of them, I think, are equally the enemy of the moderate, the middle road. The third pathway, which I call them in the Middle East, is the anti-theocrats and the anti-fascists or anti-monarchs, which are the moderate liberals that have unfortunately been relegated to the prisons of Saudi Arabia and Syria and Egypt, and are on the death end of barrel bombs, rifles, and torture throughout Syria especially. And Iran is the primary reason there has been no defeat of Assad. So if you want to see ISIS go, you have to end up seeing a Syria without Assad. ISIS exists because Assad is allowing it to exist as he decimates the moderates in Syria, and we'll talk about that later also. I think that you'll see and has been written in the Wall Street Journal and other places that is an assumption that seems to be clear, is that why is it taking the West? Why is it taking Obama and the American military to bomb ISIS when Assad could have done it? And unfortunately, he hasn't, and has been decimating moderate neighborhoods in Aleppo and Damascus. So it's interesting. Even the Arab press, which is not a friend of freedom, is saying, why aren't we looking at the greatest threat to mankind, which is Iran, and calling it out, and that the American people should listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu as he articulates the real threat of Iran. So we're looking forward to his comments tomorrow, and we will talk about them also and see what the fallout is. But I think it's important to take a look at the Arab media, which many ignore, and see what's happening to the reputation of America and the president. And you wonder why the approval ratings for President Bush are far less. The approval ratings for President Obama are far less than they were for President Bush, despite the fact that Obama campaigned that somehow they'd love us if we got out of Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, that's what happens when you no longer advance liberty and freedom and stand for principles, but rather allow the thugs and what I call a Darwin doctrine, the most evil, to reign and end up allying with people who do not share our values. When we come back, we'll continue further and engage Adam Credo. Well, this is Zuhdi Jasser, and the doctor is in the house. Proud to fill in for Seth Leibsohn as he takes some long-deserved time off this week. A lot going on, especially with Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to Congress set for tomorrow. And our country is still in search of leadership. Our country is still in search of a plan, a strategy against the jihad. And I'm an American Muslim who has been ready and willing to serve with, unfortunately, very little leadership in Washington willing to engage us. But I think that as more Americans learn about the real threat, we will eventually be able to put enough pressure on the government, on our government, to wake up to what America's role is in the world. And I think it's amazing. Our organization is the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. We believe that the way to preserve American liberty and freedom is through the separation of mosque and state. And ultimately, America was formed on that premise. Our Establishment Clause is one of the cornerstones, if not the first. It is the first liberty, and that from which every other liberty comes, which is the freedom of religion. And that ultimately you cannot have freedom of religion without a defeat of theocracy and the prevention of the establishment of the church or the mosque, as I would say as a Muslim, that is the biggest threat, and that's what ISIS is. ISIS is an Islamic state. It is theocrats on steroids. Don't make any confusion that somehow ISIS is so different from Saudi Arabia or Pakistan's Islamic Republic or Iran's Islamic Republic. They are all permutations of the same problem, which is a mixture of Islam from a theocrat and the state or government and empowerment of the clergy. So in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith, I talk about my story. Over 50% of Americans have never met a Muslim. And, I think that one of the most important things as we look at developing a strategy is that, Americans understand that we're a diverse country with populations from all over the world who come together because of one ideology. My family felt American the minute they stepped off the plane escaping Syria than they ever felt Syrian, because their government had not only failed them but became the most torturous, evil entity that they knew, and that was the Ba'athists of Syria. So in that story, I think, is the story that's true for so many Americans. We hear it whether you listen to Senator Rubio, Senator Cruz, and so many other leaders that have a story about families that have escaped oppression. But again, the story for Muslims, I think, yes, there are only a few million Muslims in America, but we are uniquely positioned to counter political Islam and all of its tentacles. And make no mistake, it's not just the violent tentacles. So you don't counter violent extremism, you counter violent Islamism. And we need leadership that will identify. Remember I talked about that Organization of Islamic Cooperation? Look at their website, the OIC. It's all about being anti-American and anti-Western, and ultimately thugocracies or theocracies like Iran and Saudi Arabia drive the position, and they spend most of their billions on demonizing the West, demonizing this country that we love, and marginalizing Muslims that are reformers. So thus we're left without a strategy. We're left on the defense. And that's what their billions of propaganda is used for, is to marginalize Americans and to marginalize Muslim reformers who in their own countries they put in jail, and in the West they put us on the defense that somehow we become Islamophobic or anti-Islam if we counter theocracy, and that could not be further from the truth. There are many Muslims who love our faith who reject political Islam and any Islamic state, not just ISIS, but any Islamic state. I think about those who are on the front lines suffering from the savagery of ISIS. Today there were 19 Assyrians released. We believe, at least reports from Fox News and Wall Street Journal and others, is that there were 19 released, but there were also 200 taken into custody and hostage of this savagery of ISIS in northeastern Syria and Iraq. What will happen to them? We saw here locally what happened to the courageous and heroic Kayla Mueller, and one after the other, James Foley, and so many others that have given their lives to try to help Syrians, to try to help countries that are convulsing in revolutions. And yet, where are the Reagans? Where are the leaders of today that will set the tone and set our vision on what can be a strategy, both short-term and long-term? But ultimately, we can't do this by allying with those countries that produce the very boot camps that are creating the ISISes of the world. The bottom line is that we need a strategy. Many people say, well, where's the Muslim? We can't have one because there's no Muslim reformers. Well, 24 of us ran an ad in the New York Times, which I spoke of earlier, that was demonizing CPAC, and yet we ran an ad there to tell those antagonists that we exist, reform-minded Muslims. 25 of us signed it, about wanting to beautify Islam against political Islam. And yes, some media, CNN and a few others, picked up on it, but again, it was simply a flash. And will they continue to persist in engaging reformers? I don't know. The time will show. Right now, it appears that our strategy is more of a whack-a-mole. We pay attention when the flash in the pan happens, and then when the flash goes away, we assume the pan has dissipated, and we're still frying. There's still millions, and if not hundreds of millions, oppressed under Islamic regimes, and we need to engage with reformers. Our government abandoned the Green Revolution in Iran. It abandoned the reform movement in Egypt and allowed it to be run by the Brotherhood, and then we saw millions reject the Brotherhood. So where are we in helping the civil societies develop? It doesn't need boots on the ground. It just needs a strategy. I mean, look at Tunisia. Nobody's talking about the fact that 6 weeks ago in Tunisia, elections rejected Ennahda. Who is Ennahda? Ennahda were the Islamist party, the Muslim Brotherhood of Tunisia. They won after the king of Tunisia stepped down in an election, which always happens because they're the most organized under these prisons that call themselves governments. But now, with a few years, the secularists organized and they won an election. And I think this is what can happen. But will they last? Will they stay? Not if we don't have a strategy. So as we go into the second hour, we're going to be joined by Adam Credo, who actually had a piece in the Free Beacon that talked about the threat to our national security of the communications lines, internet, phone lines, and he talked about what happened in Arizona just a few days ago. And then we'll talk with him. He's an expert in Iran and an expert on Israel to talk about what may happen tomorrow in the political and strategic fallout. So a lot to talk about. It's just a privilege to be with all of you, and looking forward to, on the next side of the hour, continuing our conversation about how to keep America safe, how to defeat the jihad, and how to promote liberty abroad. This is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth Leibsohn. And this is Zuhdi Jasser. Welcome back to the Seth Leibsohn Show. Again, honored to be sitting in this chair for him this week. And the doctor is in the house. You know, as I get to learn these things, I learned I get a bonus segment on this hour. So thank you, Bill, for teaching me the ropes here. I don't know how I do this without Seth's right hand, Bill Davidson. So thanks, Bill.
Glad to help.
So what we're going to do is bring Adam just a little early for this segment. So I want to welcome one of my greatest resources, who I read all the time from the Free Beacon, Adam Credo, who's a journalist and reporter extraordinaire for the Free Beacon, whose pieces on the Middle East, Israel, Iran, domestic policy as far as homeland security and others are just a primary resource for me in the work we do against Islamism and for national security. So, Adam, welcome to the Seth Leibsohn Show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And, you know, when I heard I was going to be filling in for Seth this week, I saw your piece last week about the security threat here in Arizona, and you wrote about it not only to alert us in Arizona, but to tell the country about the risks to our network and the net and cell phone coverage and others that simple hackers can do. So please tell our audience here in Arizona about what you found and what we should be aware of.
No, absolutely. And I think that at least half the audience in Arizona is probably aware of this because their cell phones, their internet, their landlines went down. And that was because of vandals who apparently cut one single fiber optic line belonging to CenturyLink. They do a lot of the internet and telecoms communications. And vandals reached a remote area in Arizona, according to the police, cut through metal sheathing that was covering this line and then sliced, apparently, with a hacksaw, one single fiber optic line. That was able to put half of the state down. Now, we're not just talking your cell phone or my cell phone. We're talking police databases, hospital records. All critical services went down because of this, and it really highlights the danger that's posed just by one person or a couple people cutting one key fiber optic line. It's not the only place we've seen it. We've seen this in New Jersey and other places with people going after the power grid. It's happened in California. So I think this one event highlights a larger problem that we have.
And how do you think our government can protect it? I mean, you have brilliantly shed some light on this. So do you have any thoughts? I mean, maybe it's beyond our pay grade, you and I, but how are they going to – what do we do next?
Well, you're right. It's a complicated problem, but one of the issues is this physical stuff that is that's power transformers, fiber optic lines. These things are in remote areas, but one, easily findable by people who want to do damage, and easily reachable by them. And what that means is that we need to have actual security in place. Of course, we talk about the cyber threat all the time, the Chinese and the Iranians even, who are committing cyber assaults on all of our critical networks. But the hard infrastructure, the physical stuff, actually poses quite a risk because oftentimes it has no security. You can go into power stations and only be stopped by a fence that has barbed wire at the top. Somebody who actually wants to do real damage will not be deterred by this. So you need to have physical security, actual people there trying to protect this kind of stuff. And I think that's something that DHS and some of these other agencies need to look at.
Well, perfect, Adam. We'll come right back in the next hour to continue our conversation.
The Seth Leibsohn Show, where it's principles, not politics. Now, guest hosting for Seth, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Welcome to the Seth Leibsohn Show. This is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, honored to be sitting in for my good friend Seth Leibsohn, and I consider him not only a friend but a mentor who I've known for quite a while, and it's just a privilege to be sitting in his chair. And so much to talk about on this busy week from not only foreign policy, national security issues, and as I prepared for the show today, I couldn't help but look at one of my friends' work, Adam Credo, and we just finished the last hour talking about the security threat that was reared here and shown by hackers on our own soil here in Arizona. That really is a teaching moment for the entire country about the vulnerability of our communication system. And before I let Adam finish his thought that unfortunately we ran up against the clock last hour, I want to remind everybody that look at what the terrorists did. They started with our financial institutions in the World Trade Center. Then they went to our military in 11/5/2009 at Fort Hood. Then they've gone to the parliaments, as we saw in Ottawa and elsewhere. Then they went to the media, as we saw in Paris. And it's not that far from, they're trying to confront every front of freedom and liberty, and one of the primary ones is communications. We see that that's what regimes do in the Middle East to prevent liberty and suppress free thought and exchange. So our grid will not only be a target for them, our media or our communications grid, because of the exchange of ideas, but because of what it could do to our national security. So, Adam, thank you for bringing light to that, and I'll let you finish your thoughts before we go on to talk about Iran.
Yeah, no, just the last point that I think is important to make with this is when you're talking about physical infrastructure, again, that's fiber optic cables, those are power transformers, the actual physical structures that allow us to be connected. We're not just talking about bringing down personal communication or repressing free speech, which you're right, a lot of regimes in the Middle East do. Here we're also talking about our connectivity to the financial infrastructure, that is making trades across the New York Stock Exchange, things of this nature, and of course bank records. Of course, this is also hospital records, police databases. All of these things can be taken out as single stroke, as we saw with the example in Arizona. And I think that's where the key thread is, really knocking us back into the Stone Age in a way that we're not able to react or even communicate.
So I hope any Homeland Security folks or experts out there, we were going to continue to talk about this because I want, as an American citizen, to know that my government is protecting us from this type of hacking, which can ultimately paralyze us as they move on to do other things in their threats. Adam, let's talk about Iran. I know ultimately, the first thing I want to set aside is just this political dysfunction that has come as a result of, the bizarre realpolitik that's happening in the diplomatic fronts, where you have a prime minister that should be able to request and be invited to speak in front of a Congress or Parliament as often is done. And I just don't get why that threatens foreign policy decisions that the president still has the right to make and should make constitutionally. I just don't understand why we as the American people can't have our members of Congress listen to the prime minister of Israel. And then if you can talk about how silent, many of the American Syrian community and others have been to welcome this discussion, because we've been shaking the trees to get Congress to pay attention to how much of a threat Iran is because of what it's doing in Syria. And yet it almost seems like the anti-Semitism or the new anti-Semitism against Israel or the political dynamic has stifled that. So if you can touch on what you think about that.
Sure, I'm happy to. And I think you're right that this has become a completely political issue, and that's actually quite a problem in terms of the policy and the diplomacy that's taking place. So one thing, obviously, I'm here in D.C. and I'm based in it, and I cover politics, but one of the problems with these issues is that it becomes political in nature rather than a policy debate and a debate about what's actually happening, and that's precisely what we've seen here with Netanyahu's address. And a lot of the people I've spoken to and sources in terms of covering this have brought up the point, and I think it's a key point, that the White House decided to make this an issue. Now, nothing happens in this city, particularly from the angle of the White House, without careful planning and somebody rolling it out. And that's exactly what we saw here when it began. There was a New York Times story that said the administration is upset over Netanyahu speaking before Congress. They actually misled in that article and said that Prime Minister Netanyahu accepted the invitation before the White House was notified, and that was somehow a breach in protocol, diplomatic protocol. Now, in fact, that was untrue. The New York Times later ran a correction on that article that was not seen by many people, but I think very noteworthy. And what that said was that, in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu did not accept that invitation until the White House had been notified. So, in fact, what we saw here was a hullabaloo over a political discussion. And what that has done is distract, actually, from the debate about Iran, the actual policy implications, where negotiations between the U.S. and Iran are. All of that has kind of been pushed to the side over this brush-up between the White House and Netanyahu, and political reporters are happy to cover it, and that leaves the people who are talking about policy kind of in the dark. It becomes a non-issue at that point, and that I think is a huge problem with it.
And Adam, one of the things I think really need to be dismissed for our listeners is this concept that somehow, I think what's driving the Obama foreign policy machinery, especially probably Valerie Jarrett, but I might be wrong there. But is this concept, somehow they think that if Prime Minister Netanyahu speaks to Congress, that somehow it will weaken their position or somehow it may make the Iranians act emotionally. We heard of a meeting in which you wrote about last week that Secretary Kerry was being shouted at by Iranian leaders. Can you speak,
right.
and I'm especially familiar with the sort of machismo of the Arab world, and I don't think the Iranian world is much different than that. Can you speak to the impact, if any, this has and their rationale in Washington that somehow Speaker Boehner is undermining the diplomatic success of a very volatile Iranian regime that's on the verge of making a nuclear pact with President Obama?
Yeah, well, you're right. That is the argument here, right? The White House would say that Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking before Congress makes Iran a political issue and somehow that undermines talks. Again, I think that's somewhat of a straw man here. If the negotiations with Iran are so fragile and so delicate that they could break down by mere dint of the Israeli leader speaking before Congress, I think that already betrays a fundamental problem in the negotiations and where you're at with them. At the same time that the White House makes this argument, the Iranians are, one, rolling out new weapons, new advanced weapons. These are boats with cruise missiles. These are attack helicopters. These are submarines. They're making arms deals with the Russians. That's something that happened recently. billion-dollar deals, mind you. And at the same time, they're also reiterating calls to destroy Israel, to kill Jewish people. The supreme leader of Iran just today put out a series of tweets, of all places, on Twitter, saying that AIPAC is a global Zionist conspiracy, and he's speaking against this. So at the same time that the White House says that talks could break down just by the Israeli prime minister being here, the Iranians are, again, puffing out their chests. They're doing actual things, such as unveiling new weapons. They continue to test ballistic missiles, things of this nature. So I think it's a complete farce for the White House to say just that Netanyahu being here is going to somehow break down talks. If the talks are on such a solid basis, somebody speaking should not be able to interfere with it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just amazing that they think somehow these vicious fascist theocrats can be tamed is appeasement on steroids. I mean, like you said, there was today Memory has a report out about an Iranian cleric that vowed to raise the flag of Islam on the White House.
That's
this
right.
was Ali Shirazi, made the comments on the official Revolutionary Guard's website. So to think that somehow their chest thumping is going to decrease because or somehow going to be out of control more than it already is because the Prime Minister of Israel decides not to make a speech to Congress, that's absurd. And I think ultimately, as my representatives from Arizona are going to make up their mind about any treaty that the president may want to sign, I would hope that they are informed. Can you speak?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that what you touch on highlights the double standard here in these negotiations, and it's something that's taken place for quite some time. I was in Vienna to cover the last round of negotiations, and I think there was the perfect example. This is where we were supposed to have a deal, but the talks were actually extended through mid-year of this year that we're in now, and that was back in November. And the double standard here is that the United States will not discuss, says quite publicly, they've told me this, the State Department, that they will not bring up things such as ballistic missiles, such as Iranian human rights, the fact that the regime is executing and hanging individuals in record numbers. It's just an unbelievable amount of state-sanctioned killing. These types of issues are not being brought up in talks out of respect for the Iranians, that we don't want to offend them or somehow push them to leave talks. But yet the Iranians at the same time, in those reports about Zarif yelling at Kerry and the other reports of this nature, I think speak to that the United States is being very careful to keep them in the talks while the Iranians are allowed to do pretty much whatever they would like to.
And Adam, I don't want to abuse our welcome with you. Are you able to stay one more segment? Is that?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Oh, great! Because what I want to do is the next step is to talk about, sort of lay out what is the Iranian threat, and how, if we had a more Reagan-esque president who actually called them the evil empire and went chest to chest against them, how that strategy could actually be borne out, and what do we think it could yield? Because you've written about centrifuges that continue to spin. You've talked right now about missiles and other things that they're doing to continue to grow their military might. So what is a way forward, short of military operations, to protect Israel, to protect America and the West, that we can do against Iran? And what do you think would be a reasonable treaty to come out, or negotiations as they should? I mean, President Reagan used to talk about trust but verify. What would be the trust but verify version with Iran that reasonable conservatives could get our head around? So when we come back, we'll talk about that. And this is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser in the house, filling in for Seth Leibsohn, good friend, and honored to sit in his chair this week as he takes some time off. I'm joined by my good friend and respected colleague, Adam Credo, journalist for the Free Beacon based out of Washington, D.C. We were talking before the break about the Iranian threat. And two things I want to do, and also just to let you know, Adam, I also want to talk before the segment's up about the connection of the strategy against Iran with the strategy against ISIS. I think that's a very important connection.
Absolutely.
But first, let's talk, if you can sort of lay out, forget what Obama's doing and all the uselessness of the last 2, 3, I don't know how many years of negotiations we've been spinning around doing nothing as their centrifuges spin. Can you lay out for us, what do you think would be the best strategy of peace through strength, how to confront Iran, and where it probably would take us if we did it right?
No, absolutely. I'm happy to. And I think the way to do this is by highlighting where the administration's at this moment, from what we actually know. Again, the details of talks are classified. The details of the extension and the interim agreement that we've had, those are all classified. So we don't know exactly, but what we seem to know is that the administration here is looking for a two-phase deal. Now, what that means is that, one, we stop their centrifuges, at least temporarily, but that includes a sunset clause. And what that means is at the end of 10 years, and the president said this again today in an interview with Reuters, is that at the end of 10 years, the Iranians are allowed to ramp up their program once again. We do very little to actually dismantle the infrastructure, which again is the key point. We started these talks and this negotiation with Iran with the idea that we would shut down their ability to spin centrifuges and enrich uranium which can, of course, fuel a nuclear bomb. They've done more than that. They've also built light water reactors. The State Department has told me that these light water reactors, which again give them another path to the bomb, are actually okay under the interim agreement, which again is a sign that this is not something that will be accounted for in any sort of final deal. So the issue always becomes, no matter what you allow them or what you don't, say that you dismantle everything, the Iranians have a history of obfuscation, right, of not telling us what they're actually doing and of lying. The United Nations, just again today, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, these are the international inspectors, they again told us today Iran is not cooperating with their investigations. And this is the critical issue, that no matter what deal you strike, no matter what the context of it is, and people can argue over numbers of centrifuges or what exactly the parameters should be, if you don't have the ability to verify it and trust the Iranians and take them at their word, you virtually have nothing, and it doesn't matter. And the Iranians in particular, just like the North Koreans, have a history of hiding their facilities, not revealing them, and continuing to do work even while they say they don't. And that's really the critical issue here, I think.
And do you think sanctions were working? I mean, again, many of us American Syrians were just horrified that there were billions of dollars of sanctions relieved that we felt ultimately ending up in Syria with Assad helping kill more genocidal actions against especially Sunnis in Syria. So what do you think sanctions can do, or have they been working? What should we be doing?
They did work. It is true. They effectively worked, and we have ways to demonstrate that, and that's the issues that the Iranian economy had, the inflation in their currency, things of this nature. All the signs were there that sanctions were actually harming Iran and beginning to cripple them, but we've rolled them back. That's something we started doing when we struck the first interim nuclear agreement with Iran. That was sanctions relief and rolling back sanctions. Now, the sanctions relief, when all was said and done, through the end of March, July, when this round of talks is set to expire, it'll be about $11.9 billion in unfrozen cash assets that have been returned to the Iranian regime. Now, the issue with this money, and that senators like Senator Kirk and others have made an issue of, is that it comes with no strings attached. We unfreeze it, and the Iranians can do what they want with it. There's no restrictions on funding of terrorism, these types of things. So when you mention Syria, yes, there's a possibility and a good chance that the Iranians are spending money there. You look at Hezbollah, they're clearly funding them. You look at what's happening in Yemen, it has the fingerprint of the Iranians. You look at what's happening in Iraq, it has the fingerprints of the Iranians. So all of this money and all of the sanctions relief gets to an end of Iran trying to exert regional hegemony and expand its empire.
And
that's exactly what we're seeing.
And the administration rejects that. They deny that they freed up that much money, and I don't know how they can deny it.
I'd be shocked if they do. I've been told by the State Department specifically, and I've written about it. I have a list of the payments that have gone out by month, and the tally is, when you add it up, maybe they're not adding it up, but the total is about $11.9 billion since we started unfreezing assets to the Iranian regime. It's quite a bit of money.
So Adam, that's the strategy against Iran. Let's link that back to the strategy against ISIS. It was the most unfathomable thing for me in the past few months was to see some chatter. I don't know if it was diplomatic chatter or what it was, but it was in Middle East media that somehow the administration sort of guaranteed Assad and or Iran that our attacks on ISIS would not harm them, that ultimately it would be in synergy with what they were doing. So ultimately, how do you see that? How do you see us putting that back in the bottle? And I see the Shia jihadists as the other side of the coin of the Sunni jihadists, and that both sides are equally evil. And how can we teach Americans to look at a different or propose some strategy which currently the president has not been offering?
Well, you're right. There's a double standard there, and we're clearly picking sides in a situation where it's untenable to pick sides because they're both evil and bad and forces that we need to work against. In Iraq and in Syria, it's interesting where you see this fight with ISIS because the Iranians are present in both places. Now, in Iraq particularly, while the U.S. has denied working explicitly with the Iranians, it's kind of a wink and nod situation. You remember the president in the State of the Union address said that the Iranians can be a constructive player. We should not we should not be misled. He's clearly talking about the situation in Iraq. Further evidence of this is Dempsey, who says that Iran can play a positive role. They're literally saying that Iran could have a positive role in Iraq, which I think a lot of people would push back against quite vociferously, that there's no way for the Iranians to have a positive impact there. But de facto, we have a policy of tepidly endorsing what they're doing and even working with them, even if it's just turning a blind eye. And that's the same thing you see in Syria with ISIS, that we've worked ourselves into a situation where the president wants to go after specifically ISIS. You can see the Pentagon releasing press releases every day talking about their strikes on ISIS. And in Syria, all this has done is bolster Assad. And people have rightly criticized that this has only gotten us into a situation where we've taken the focus off Assad, and all of those red lines and all of those other things are kind of moot at this point.
And briefly, Adam, last in maybe 20 seconds, do you think there's, I've always felt that it's pretty obvious if you look at the bombing patterns in Syria that Assad has avoided ISIS. And it's been written about in the Wall Street Journal. Do you think there's some validity to that, why we've had to bomb them while he claims they're his enemy and yet he bombs moderate neighborhoods?
I think it's easier and more convenient to bomb moderate neighborhoods for him because this achieves his political goal, right? Of course, which is the destruction of people that disagree with him. So that fits into his pattern. But yes, when you have the U.S. saying that they're going to come in and eradicate this threat, there's no reason why he would expend the resources when he knows, or at least has some sort of confidence, that the U.S. will do it itself.
Well, Adam Credo from the Free Beacon, thank you for your truth, for your courage, for your time to be with us today in Seth's absence. We really appreciate all your work, and stay safe, my friend.
Thank you. It's my absolute pleasure, and I do appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care. And when we come back, we'll continue the conversation about where our country should be going. Welcome back to the Seth Leibsohn Show. This is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser in the house for Seth Leibsohn, who is taking some well-deserved time off, and making our way through the second hour. I hope all of you, as we get to be good friends this week, look me up on Facebook at MZ Jasser, and Twitter. I'm one of those Twitter nerds. I love Twitter, so follow me at Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, DRZUHDI, Jasser, JASSER, or at our organization at AIF Democracy. Our website is www.aifdemocracy.org, so follow us, please, and sign up for our newsletter. We've had quite a diverse discussion today, Bill. We've started with my background, went to talk a little bit about Star Trek and the politics of science fiction, and then went on to the ideology that we're fighting. And Adam just educated us a little bit about, quite a bit about Iran sanctions and where we should be headed and strategically, as tomorrow we wait to listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was scheduled to speak at 9 o'clock Arizona time, 11 o'clock Eastern, to Congress. So a lot to follow this week as we listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and hopefully we can avoid the political fallout. Again, I'm glad to be with you in the arena. We talked about Teddy Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's speech on citizenship in the Republic, and all of us are citizens. And again, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming. And again, we're in the arena. This program, Seth's in the arena, leading us with where we should be headed. And it's amazing to me that so few of us are able to have this conversation. You think back at the shootings, the assassinations of these cartoonists in Paris over a month ago. There were those who wrote in the New York Times that, well, maybe they should have been a little more respectful of a faith, my faith of Islam. And yet there was also another writer in the New York Times who said the blasphemy we need. And what was he writing about? He was writing about the fact that a measure of a free society is not measured by those that ultimately say things that are not offensive and most people wouldn't raise an eyebrow at. The measure of a free society is being able to say things that many would perceive as offensive and not having violence ensue. And ultimately, that was what Charlie Hebdo's magazine did for France. And I might be offended as a Muslim, but as an American and as French citizens who believe they should say what they can and want, ultimately nobody ever died from words on a paper or pictures on a paper. And this is, I think, the difference between theocrats and liberals. And we need presidents and leaders in Congress and elsewhere that are willing to stand up for our values. And I think this is the time that we're in. You can't defeat an enemy that you can't name by simply saying we're going to wait to find and defeat the tactic. Iran, you can try to push that mud uphill as much as you want, but the bottom line is if you're ever going to wash away all that mud comes from an end-of-times theology that believes that the world will be dominated by their form of Islam. And on the front lines against their form of Islam are moderate Muslims. Muslims that love their faith but want nothing to do with the Shia theocracy or the Sunni theocracy of ISIS. And unfortunately, the political obsessions of back and forth left and right politics in Washington, we seem to have forgotten what the bigger picture is and what the narrative really is. I talk about it every day at Facebook, at my MZ Jasser Facebook page. My Twitter handle is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, Dr. Zuhdi, Zuhdi, Jasser, Jasser. Join me online in a conversation about all of these issues as we confront. It's amazing. You follow me on Twitter, you'll find ISIS guys out of Australia that have an organization called Sharia for Australia that target me as being sort of the whatever du jour conspiracy you'd like. They claim that I'm a part of, and they conveniently ignore the fact that I'm an American Muslim and joined by many, many American Muslims that love our faith and reject the Islamic State and all Islamic states. It's amazing. If you look at this movement, Sharia for Australia, the shootings that happened in Sydney were, we believe, had some connections to the radicalizations by some of the ideologies of that group. And many of these groups, you can use terms like, oh, they've hijacked our faith. But, hijacking sounds like there's nothing really endemically needing reform. It's just some external hijacker. I'll tell you, the Islam I know doesn't need reform, but I'm adult enough and mature enough to understand that the Islam of our leadership, of the clerics of Al-Azhar University, of the clerics of Saudi universities and governments that are fueled by billions, our leadership, even of most of the Islamic leadership in America, is either in denial or part of this OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, evil empire that wants to continue to control Muslim populations around the world and ultimately under the boots of theocracy. And they do it here in America. They tell us that if we criticize them, we're Islamophobes and bigots. So ultimately they're invoking blasphemy laws, anti-blasphemy laws in the land of freedom by making people who question political Islam be feared as labeled as bigots. And they claim that, well, we're the victims, we're the, ultimately the problem. And, you can't, our founding fathers created this great nation in this battle against theocracy. So why can Christianity go through that same battle and revolution that ultimately took another 200 plus years to make it through a civil war and many course corrections towards a beautiful republic that we have today? But as Ronald Reagan said, freedom is only one generation from being lost, or at least I'm paraphrasing what he said. And I can tell you that Islamism is the challenge of the 21st century, and America's identity is part of that challenge, and that it needs to own up to our religious freedom to confront political Islam as the threat. So until we confront it, we Muslims will be left in denial. We're like trying to confront drunk driving without addressing the alcoholism. The alcoholism is the Islamism, the ideology that fuels all these Islamic states and movements like the Muslim Brotherhood and on. The battle's happening. It's on the front lines in Egypt and in the internet, on Twitter, on Facebook, and it's there. We just have been ignoring it. So join me in that, and we'll come back and continue. Welcome back. This is Zudy Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. I'm humbled to be here this week, and I look forward to spending more time talking to you about so many different issues. And I can't tell you how much of a master Bill is here. Has trained me in no time to stick to the clock and do things the way I should as a guest host. So now I know why Seth loves working here. It's amazing that, as we try to have a conversation about America and talk about what leadership is and what we're fighting and the narrative that we are, you can't do this unless we have leadership. It's not only from the president and the White House, but in media, in universities, in the thought leaders of America that are willing to address the ideology. And as we were talking about with Adam, with what should be the strategy, not only, okay, we realize the president's strategy is all screwed up and has no direction and is appeasement. Well, what should it be? We should, and this is something I learned at CPAC, we talked about at CPAC frequently. One of the problems of the conservative movement has been that we were very good at tearing down what the opposition, the socialists, the collectivists amongst us in this country that ultimately feel government is the solution rather than the problem of what it is. But ultimately, our government does have some important roles, and one of them is national security. So what should be the solution? And we've been torn by two extremes in America. One extreme, which has been dominating the White House and most of the narrative, is that, well, every Muslim is peaceful and that there's no radical Muslims out there. We don't need a strategy against Islamism. It's a strategy just against these crazy, psychotic militants, and they're just sort of aberrations. Forget the fact that the OIC is producing these to the tune of billions and billions of dollars of ideology spread. Then the other side of the equation is those that believe that, well, every Muslim's a possible terrorist and that there is no solution, and somehow we either build a wall around America or I don't know what, talking about possibly trying to convert a quarter of the world's population, which is absurd. So ultimately, I think my role, and this is why I do this, and have dedicated my life to fighting political Islam, I don't do this because it's my faith. I think ultimately every faith is personal, and God will figure that out. I do this because American national security is at stake. Freedom in the West is at stake. The fronts started in our business community at World Trade Center and evolved to our military. Every military member now is on the front line, whether they are in a theater of operation or if they're at Fort Hood or Fort Dix or any of the places. The National Guard that's been attacked in Arkansas and elsewhere, every one of them, because they wear a uniform, is being targeted because they represent freedom. This is what the radicals, the militants, want to do. They are threatened by our forces, by our ideas. Then it went to the parliaments in Ottawa, and then it went to the media. And ultimately, I'm sure it'll continue to confront every front of freedom. So I think Seth's program titled Principles, Not Politics is so perfect for what I do, and why I'm here is that ultimately it's about what are the principles that our country stands for. Our strategy should be one of a liberty doctrine. You listen, do you know the Secretary Rice had a speech in which she laid out the president's strategy to Brookings, I believe, a few weeks ago, a month or two ago, in which she said the strategy is strategic patience. A world that says that America and the free world is waiting patiently for things to just happen on their own is what I would call a Darwin doctrine, where you let the most evil evolve, and those vacuums that are being created in the Arab awakening, in the wake of the Arab awakening, will be filled by Iran, by Saudi Arabia, by China, by Russia. And we see what Russia's doing in the Ukraine and elsewhere. So this is what happens with strategic patience. This is what happens with the appeasement of regimes like Iran, where the president can't even cite the names of prisoners of conscience that like Pastor Abdini, who's been in jail for years now simply because he's a Christian in Iran, or Raif Badawi, who's being flogged, as I mentioned earlier, and so many of us have tried to get the president to mention his name from the White House, and yet they feel that this would get in the way. When Fareed Zakaria on CNN asked him about Raif Badawi, the president said, well, we have to be careful not to let the humanitarian plight, and I'm paraphrasing, but let the humanitarian plight of individuals obscure a progress in diplomatic processes. This is coming from the same administration that Secretary Kerry a couple years ago visiting Saudi Arabia said, we understand that their standards in Saudi Arabia for women are different than ours. Understand? The women in that country want equality, at least the ones that I've talked to in the times I've been there. They want to shed the regime's oppression, the gender apartheid that exists in Saudi Arabia, and they're not given the opportunities. And the leaders of the free world reject them and ignore them, instead to cozy up to their oppressors for the short-term satisfaction of having a legacy that they've signed some type of pact with Iran, while they simply let the clock tick as they strengthen themselves underground and spin centrifuges and arm themselves to the teeth and annex countries like Syria via a genocide of populations like our families in Aleppo and Damascus. It's heartbreaking. But, as Teddy Roosevelt's quote earlier said, and as Ronald Reagan talked about, and so many true leaders have said, our freedom is only a generation from vanishing. And my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, talks about that. And that ultimately, at the end of my book, I have a letter to my kids, and I hope some of you will have time to read it. In that letter, I tell them that one of the most beautiful experiences for a Muslim is performing the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, where you go and circumambulate around that area in which we think our faith started, in which we believe it started, and men and women pray next to each other, they walk together, they have no material wealth, they go in a white sheet and have equality of all races and genders and coming together in prayer for 10 days. Outside of that mosque is the most oppressive, draconian regime on the planet that does things in the name of Islam. So you see two ends of the spectrum. And I tell my kids that ultimately, until our faith can reconcile those two extremes and bring the vast population of the world that's Muslim towards liberty, towards freedom, ultimately the world will suffer, because theocracy never works. Theocracy oppresses mankind. And unless liberty is promoted by those through strength and respect and freedom, we will continue to suffer its wrath. And ISIS is a symptom. The Saudis are a symptom. The Pakistani regime, the Iranian regime is a symptom of theocracy, and the only solution is liberty. The difference, the ISIS guys want to die for the Islamic State. And I learned something from reading Eric Hoffer's book on The Believer. He said, what makes people lead who can change are those who have a cause they want to die for. I joined the Navy because I wanted to die for America. I could die for America. And I think this is what makes us different, is Muslims who are not radicalized are those who would die for freedom and liberty. That's what prevents the radicalization of Muslims, not countering violent extremism. Will they die for America and freedom, or will they die for ISIS and or a Islamic State? Until we can make the narrative that, we're never going to win this war. And this is Zuhdi Jasser joining you to close out our program this evening, and it's been a pleasure to sit in for Seth Leibsohn. I hope he's having a great time, because I certainly am sitting in his chair, and I'm humbled by the opportunity to speak to his intelligent and brilliant American audience. So, in the last few minutes, I wanted to talk about one thing. I was watching Saturday Night Live, and I wanted to get a little lighter if I could. I was watching Saturday Night Live, and there was this little commercial that now has gotten a lot of blowback on the internet. A commercial in which it was originally a play off a Super Bowl commercial, Toyota, in which a dad was bringing his daughter to the airport, and she was leaving to join the Army. And it was a touching commercial in Super Bowl about a dad saying bye to his daughter in his Toyota. Well, in this commercial, they showed a a Anglo-Saxon white American dad bringing his white American daughter, who was played by Dakota Johnson, the star of 50 Shades of Grey. And she's in tears as she leaves, and gets in a pickup truck of an ISIS pickup truck, and they start shooting their guns, and he's in tears, proud of her that she's joining a movement. And obviously they were being sarcastic and trying to exemplify how the satirical could maybe awaken us. I have to tell you, I was split on what I felt, and the Internet's been split on that. But I want you to think about really what should be our reaction. In some ways, we were talking about women's rights. It was a bit absurd to see the star of a hypersexual film now be sort of mocking going and joining ISIS, which enslaves and tortures and rapes women on a daily basis. So that offended me on the first count. The second count was we Muslims are having a horrible time trying to prevent this very radicalization in which Muslim fathers or mothers are seeing their kids, their daughters, disappear to join ISIS. And while I understand the satire, and maybe it woke up an audience that might not have cared at all about ISIS to pay attention, take a look at that ad, and we'll talk a little tomorrow about, maybe what, if it was on the mark or not. But look at my Facebook. I had a post about that ad. I'd welcome your input at MZ Jasser on my Facebook page to join me in a conversation about, was that funny or was it inappropriate? And how do we message against the radicals? The daughters like that are going to serve because they believe in Islamo-patriotism. They want to serve the Islamic State. They want to serve the global jihad. And I, as a Muslim, want to serve America, want to keep our country safe against the radicals, against the militants, not only amongst us, which are a small number, but globally, against the Iranian regimes, the Muslim Brotherhood movements that are winning elections, that are pluralities, that are huge movements that need to be countered by a movement of liberal patriotism. So join me on Twitter at Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, DRZUHDI Jasser, JASSER, on Facebook at MZ Jasser, and at our website at AIFdemocracy.org. My book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith, gets into so many of these issues. Tomorrow we'll have a lot to talk about when we talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to Congress. Join me as we continue this conversation. This is Zuhdi Jasser. Thank you.